From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern.
It's happening right now, the meeting at the White House between President Biden, Speaker McCarthy, and the other congressional leaders, as you can see here, talking about the rapidly approaching debt ceiling and what to do about it.
Also, former President Trump found liable in order to pay writer E. Jean Carroll $5 million in a sexual assault suit against him.
And more from Washington today. Senator Dianne Feinstein on her way back to town, back to the Senate after recovering from a bout with shingles. Her spokesperson saying she may be in place for votes tonight. And President Biden giving some comments just moments before the debt ceiling talks begin. Anne-Marie, they're actually in the room right now. They're in the Oval Office. We've seen it. We know it's real. Joe Biden, the four major leaders in Congress are at it.
And most importantly, it's really the meeting and the rapport between him and Speaker McCarthy that matters so much here, because McConnell's already said it is up to these two individuals. We're not going to play a part. And obviously, the president's going to be leading negotiations for the Democrats. But he didn't give much away, did he, before he sat down with them? The only thing he said to reporters is that they had a lot of problems to solve. Take a listen.
Welcome. I'm sure that my colleagues and I will be saying things to you after this is all over. But in the meantime, just wanted to welcome you, let you know what we're doing. We're not going to take any questions now. We're going to get started. We're going to solve all the world's problems.
Solving all the world's problems today. That's great.
Bringing a little
Rather
levity
ambitious.
to a situation that has been quite difficult for them.
In an Oval Office that had no smiles otherwise. We should, by the way, bring everyone up to date on a couple of things. We've actually had a bit of news going into this meeting as they send messages through the media. Kevin McCarthy says he does not support a short-term raise to bring the debt ceiling higher or suspend the debt ceiling till September 30th, as many have suggested, Anne-Marie. And the White House replies with its own message.
Well, they almost agree on this.
Yeah, they said they don't have that as part of the plan.
This is the one thing they agree on. They don't want to kick the can down the road. Let's come to an agreement. But obviously, it's because Speaker McCarthy wants a strings-attached agreement, and the White House says, no, we just want you to raise the debt ceiling in a clean manner.
Well, good thing we have a smart panel to get into all of this today. Joining us around the table, Bloomberg's Nancy Cook and Enda Curran. Great to have both of you with us. Nancy, I'll start with you, as you spent a good long time as a White House correspondent. Bring us inside the room here. There's quite a bit of choreography at play. We saw them, presidents in the chair. You've got the leaders on the couches. And there's a lot of staffers in the room, too.
Yeah, there's a ton of President Biden's top aides in the room, people who have worked with him for a long time. Shalonda Young, who is the head of the Office of Management and Budget, is there as well. What we're really expecting from this meeting is, as you said, it's very choreographed. So we're really expecting there to be not a ton of leeway made in the negotiations. It's really so that each side can come out of this and show that they were there and they met. But we are expecting them to really come out of the meeting and continue to blame each other as the clock is ticking towards needing to take some action.
What would be an optimistic view coming out of this meeting? Is it just that they even just decide, okay, we'll meet again? Is that the bar?
I think that would be a huge bar, but you have to remember that President Biden is leaving for a trip, and he is going to Japan and Australia. So he has a ton of things on his plate, including a lot of international travel. And so that really, hurts them working towards a compromise as well.
We don't know how this is going to end or what time it's going to end, Anne-Marie. A lot of folks are watching the stakeout position where the microphones are set up in the White House driveway. I suspect we'll hear from Kevin McCarthy on his way out, unless they really don't want to talk about this. But the stakes are high here, and the markets are watching. The stock market has so far been kind of whistling past the graveyard, and I realize that the bond market is a different matter. But how important will be the words tonight when he comes out of this door in the West Wing? The sense of what happened here, whether there was progress, all leading up to a CPI report tomorrow morning. This is high stakes for the stock market.
Yeah, but I think the markets and the economy now are watching this very closely. We did have a big surge in Treasury bill yields today. That does indicate that traders are getting nervous. Indicates, of course, that the Treasury is coming up close to that deadline where they will run out of money, the so-called X date that people in the market talk about. So it is starting to happen in the market. We do, of course, know that Janet Yellen as well, of course, is the Treasury Secretary, is talking about cutting short her trip to the G7. That's not a good look for the US at the world stage, among the world's biggest industrialized economies. So the jitters are starting to flow through. I don't think anyone is expecting much of a breakthrough, as Nancy was saying, on the political side today.
Yeah.
But everyone is watching where this is going to go.
So who blinks first, the markets or the politicians?
So there is a view out there that the markets will, sooner or later, stir up the volatility and put pressure on the politicians to respond, and maybe then they cut the deal like they have in the past. The markets haven't quite gotten to that point yet, though, because there still is this feeling among the economists and people that I speak to that ultimately the politicians will reach a deal and that they will find a way out of this. But at the same time, they're cutting it pretty close by all accounts.
Nancy, talk to us about the choreography coming out of this meeting as well. I suspect that Kevin McCarthy will address reporters. We saw him do that following their first meeting at the beginning of February. We need to remember that meeting took place as well. Then Democratic leaders potentially come after. Mitch McConnell, not necessarily one for a microphone in the driveway, right?
Yeah, usually Mitch McConnell, if he talks to reporters, will go back to the Capitol to do it. But what we're likely to see is that Kevin McCarthy will come out to, there's a group right out in front of the White House. He'll talk to a group of reporters there, put his own spin on events. The White House is likely to put out some sort of statement outlining their view on things. And everybody is really going to try to paint the other side as extreme and unwilling to compromise. And that will really flow into tonight.
Enda talks about the fact that market participants think, yes, we've seen this movie before and we'll somehow get to a deal. But that's not really the same makeup, especially if you look at 2011. It's not the same makeup of the individuals that are controlling Congress or pushing maybe the speaker in one direction that are controlling Congress. Isn't potentially there a higher probability this time around that they're cutting it not just close, but we actually do hit a default of some sort?
Well, I think that there's a higher probability because, as you said, the Republicans in Congress, it's a much different makeup. I think Kevin McCarthy owes his speakership to a group of people who are much more willing to default. I think that in addition to sort of the pressure that we'll see from the markets, we may over the next few weeks start to hear more pressure from CEOs and business leaders. They've been very quiet so far and have basically taken the posture of we're going to let the kids work it out. But I think that that will grow, they'll grow tired of that too as we see more market volatility. So I think we'll just see heightened pressure as the days go on from outside voices, business leaders, from the markets, on both Republicans and Democrats to do something.
We got another major story on our hands here today, and that's yet another legal action against Donald Trump, Anne-Marie. This would normally be a lead story on any other day, but we're dealing with a few major plates that were spinning in the air at once. A New York jury, though, has found Donald Trump liable for sexually assaulting and defaming E. Jean Carroll. Nancy, I know this is one that you've had an eye on as well as you cover Trump world. Is this just another brick in the wall when it comes to legal matters involving Trump, or do his supporters pay attention to this?
I mean, it remains to be seen. We have seen so many instances where people thought that President Trump would be wounded politically by whatever happened, be it from the indictment, most recently by the Manhattan District Attorney, to the Access Hollywood tape during his campaign where he said, you can just grab women and do whatever you want. We have not seen something that really stuck. I mean, I do think it's remarkable that we have a former president and potentially the frontrunner for the GOP nomination now found guilty of sexual assault. That's not something that we've seen before. It's another one for the history books, but I'm not sure it will make a real hurt him with his particular Republican base.
It's pretty remarkable.
I mean, you're looking at 2024. You literally moments ago just put out a great scoop on the Bloomberg terminal. Steve Schwartzman is holding off on donating money to Governor DeSantis. Where are the megabucks going to be going? Well,
so far, we're not seeing the megabucks go anywhere, and that is a huge part of the story for 2024. They're not going to Trump because a lot of donors are tired of what he did on January 6th. They don't like the way he handled COVID. They don't like a lot of his rhetoric, but they're not really sold on any of the other candidates. And I think that is part of the problem that Republicans face. They have not found a real suitable alternative to Trump.
Republicans and market participants all at the moment, no matter what the story is. They're on the sidelines, waiting and seeing, on the pause. All right, our thanks to Bloomberg's Nancy Cook and Enda Curran there. Coming up on the program, Virginia Senator Mark Warner will be here with his take on where things should go from here on the fight over the debt ceiling. That's next on Balance of Power from Washington. This is Bloomberg.
That is affecting every American family with inflation.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV as we bring you live pictures and sound from the stakeout position out in front of the West Wing. This is Speaker McCarthy, flanked by Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
What's changed is the House has raised the debt ceiling and passed the bill. That's why we had a meeting today. Everybody in this meeting reiterated the positions they were at. I didn't see any new movement. The president said the staff should get back together. But I was very clear with the president. We have now just 2 weeks to go. If Chuck Schumer could pass something, we'd go to conference right away and solve that. But I don't think Chuck Schumer can pass anything. They haven't dealt with it. Unfortunately, the president has waited 97 days without ever meeting. Every day I asked, could we meet? And he said no. The House has raised the debt ceiling in a responsible manner, curve our spending at the same time, bring us economic growth. And I asked the president this simple question. Does he not believe there's any place we could find savings? He signed a bill that the House passed, became law, that the pandemic is over. We have $50 to $60 billion that have sat out there that's been appropriated for more than 2 years that we could pull back and save the taxpayer money. We could put in growth packages that help us economically, cutting the red tape so we could build things in America again. We could have items that he actually voted for, like work requirements that just passed in Wisconsin with 82% of the vote, to help our supply chain get stronger. I would hope that he would be willing to negotiate for the next 2 weeks so we could actually solve this problem and not take America on the brink.
Well, as I think all of you know, I've been through a few debt ceilings over the years. Let me first make the point, the United States is not going to default. It never has, and it never will. However, elections have consequences. We now have divided government. We didn't have a divided government last year. In 2019, I told President Trump, who was no fan of Speaker Pelosi, that they needed to work it out. Why? We had divided government. The solution to this problem lies with two people: the President of the United States, who can sign a bill and deliver the members of his party to vote for it, and the Speaker of the House. There is no sentiment in the Senate, certainly not 60 votes, for a clean debt ceiling. So there must be an agreement, and the sooner the President and the Speaker can reach an agreement, the sooner we can solve the problem.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Did the President tell you that there were any spending cuts that he would be open to?
Well, I asked him numerous times, are there some places we could find savings? He wouldn't give me any, so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find them. You can't spend more money, which his budget does, than the pandemic. They added $6 trillion when they're in the majority, and what happened? We got inflation. We hurt every family in America. I think the best thing we could do is find places that we can eliminate waste, find places that we can grow this economy, and that's exactly what the House bill does. Look, I would have loved to have spent from February 1st on working together and negotiating something. Unfortunately, he would never meet with us. So I had to look for things that Democrats had agreed to before. Like, Senator Manchin believes that we should cap the growth going forward. So we would take the next 10 years and we would spend more each year, but only 1%. That would save us a lot of money. We'd find savings like COVID money, bringing it back. We'd find ways to grow the economy by making us energy independent, lowering the cost of energy, but at the same time changing the red tape on the permitting reform so we could build things again. I thought that was a common ground idea that we can all get together on. So we had made sure that we wouldn't go into default, so the House raised the debt limit and also had growth for the rest. Yes.
Speaker, what is the path forward?
Was there movement forward in this? Do you feel confident that June 1st deadline?
I didn't see much difference in the statements from the president or from Chuck Schumer, for that fact. I mean, Chuck's whole idea before was to take us to the brink and someone's going to have to break, right? I don't want to play politics with this. I think this is too important. That's why 3 months ago I came to the president. Can't we find a way? I know we're both going to have to give and take. That's the way the founders have created our government, a House, a Senate, the executive branch. So let's sit down together, find places we can agree upon, and get this done. Because they ignored us, we had to go on our own, and we passed a bill to do that. Yes.
What are the odds of default now after this meeting, and what happens next?
Well, the House made sure we wouldn't have default because we raised the debt limit. Now, the Senate hasn't done anything. Well, the Senate hasn't done anything. That would come down really to Chuck Schumer and the president. The House made sure we wouldn't default. We are ones who raised the debt limit. We've sent it to the Senate. We've sat with the president. I've tried to. For 97 days, he's had said no. I think the only reason we are actually here today is because we passed something. But I hope you only got about 2 more weeks to try to get this done.
Mr. Speaker, Congress does have the purse strings here. And if you are not able to prevent default, are you prepared to own it?
Well, I don't see how we would own it if we raised the debt limit. So if I look back, the House raised the debt ceiling, the Senate has not, and the president hadn't negotiated. So I find that very odd, yes.
Speaker, did the president bring any proposals to this meeting? And is there a plan for another meeting after this? When would that be? And one question to Leader McConnell, how is the president's posture in this meeting different than how you've seen him in the past over this very same issue?
This is live from the driveway in front of the West Wing. Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who is actually joined by Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader there, in what could be an extended question and answer session here. Anne-Marie, this is very similar to what happened following his most recent meeting with President Biden the beginning of February. We did expect this. This is the way it goes. We were looking for some news to be made at the stakeout cameras, and I think that, in fact, there was some news, as Speaker McCarthy says he could not get the president to identify one point of savings, one budget cut in their negotiations here. It's very likely that we will hear from the Democratic leaders next who were in that meeting. So we'll keep an eye on the driveway for you as we turn to Senator Mark Warner, the Democratic senator from Virginia, for the latest on all of this. Senator, it's great to have you with us, and we appreciate your joining us on such a busy day. I have to admit, based on the tone that we heard there from Speaker McCarthy particularly, it doesn't sound like much was accomplished, if anything, in that meeting. What's your take?
Well, again, I'd like to hear from the president and the Democrats, but I think we've all seen this this movie before, that the first meeting, normally much doesn't come out of it. I would love to hear if the speaker offered any concessions from his proposal, because one of the things that's pretty clear is a proposal that even his Republicans couldn't agree what's in it, because they keep saying, oh, we didn't mean to cut that, we didn't mean to cut that. And then you've got at least 10 or 12 Republicans who've said that was literally the floor, so the speaker has no ability to move. I would love to hear whether the speaker's got ability to move on negotiations, or whether he's going to be held to this extraordinary standard. I do hope what I heard from Leader McConnell, that we're not going to default. Leader McConnell's also been through a number of these. I think that was, good news. Nothing would be worse. Nothing would be a greater gift to Vladimir Putin or to President Xi in China than to have this unforced error of the United States defaulting as we go into Memorial Day weekend.
Others like Avril Haines agree with you there. There's one moment of progress, which is that Speaker McCarthy has now said that President Biden and congressional leaders will meet again Friday. So they are pushing this forward. But Speaker McCarthy there said that he actually went and looked for items that some Democrats could potentially get behind, like clawing back those COVID funds. What he wants to do, in his terms, to the public right now in the driveway, is that he wants to have a fair negotiation about this. Do you think it's too late? Should Biden have waited more than 3 months to get in a room with this man?
I think we should have done what we did 3 times under Trump, which was raise the debt ceiling and then have another debate about the budget, spending and otherwise. I thought it was a little bit ironic that the Speaker was indicating all this additional debt that was added. A lot of that was actually under President Trump. And let me be clear, I voted for it in terms of the additional remarkable amounts of money we spent on COVID relief. I'd vote for it again because we just didn't know what we were, the abyss we might be heading into. So the one thing I do think, shame on the Democrats, when we raised this 3 times under Trump, we should have gotten rid of this political hand grenade. No other industrial nation in the world says after the money has been committed, after it's been spent, are we going to actually pay down the credit card that we've made commitments on? This is a political hand grenade that unfortunately is now being used as a threat. But there are things, I mean, listen, I voted for regulatory reform. I've been part of efforts in the past. I was actually part of the whole supportive of the Simpson-Bowles effort more than a decade ago. I'm probably going much further than most folks in both parties would go. But there ought to be a time and place to do that, and that ought to be through the normal appropriations process. We've heard nothing in this conversation so far about revenues. If you really want to deal with our national debt at 32 trillion, close to 32 trillion, you may need spending cuts, but you're going to need additional revenues as well. This is not the place, I think, where you get that kind of meaningful debate.
Something needs to break the standoff here at some point. Of course, Senator, you've been involved in any number of negotiations. What can the president potentially offer? What can Democrats offer that would be attractive to Speaker McCarthy if we get to it from that angle? Is it permitting reform? Is there maybe an issue that hasn't been directly tied to this budget debate, if we can call it a debate yet, that would be attractive enough for the Speaker to bring back to his caucus and say, you know what, let's lift the debt ceiling because we got this?
I don't know. I'm anxious to hear the president's characterization of this meeting. We've heard one side. We ought to owe it to hear from both. I do worry about precedent setting where this debt ceiling, and remember that what the House did was they only raised the debt ceiling, I believe, for a year, so you'd have exactly this we'd have a rerun of this movie a year from now, which doesn't make much sense to me. But I get the fact that there's concern that if you allow this kind of political hand grenade to be used and, in effect, threaten the full faith and credit of the United States, it's going to come back and bite you again. Listen, I'm more than willing, and I've been part of, as you mentioned, virtually every bipartisan gang that's been around the last decade. I'd try to be in one of those rooms, but there's a time and place for that, not with this ticking time bomb of potentially the country going into default and driving up interest rates, ruining people's 401k plans, particularly when you've got a spending plan or a spending cut plan that the House put forward that only attacks about a third of the budget. And I got Republican members saying, well, we don't want to really touch veterans. We don't want to really touch the Border Patrol, although they are all included in the cuts that were put forward by the House.
But at the end of the day, Senator, right now, the only bill that's passed is the one in the House that Speaker McCarthy put forward, and we're now a month into a potential X date. Do you think the White House should start looking at what if we were to default and go over that X date? Should they start prioritizing what bills they will pay?
There is the idea that you can do prioritization, I think, has been pretty soundly debunked by economists, by folks from both administrations in the past, Democrats and Republicans, this idea that we're going to pay our bondholders and then maybe pay some of our soldiers but not our veterans, or maybe pay Social Security but not Medicare. That's lunacy. Of course, we may be in lunatic times. I think that we ought to go ahead and there ought to be a process in place, raise this debt ceiling. And if we want to have this all-out debate, then let's have it. But let's not have it with this literally national security as well as economic time bomb that's now just a few weeks away.
Senator, how worried are you about what happens in the markets tomorrow? Of course, we're talking on Bloomberg here. The Speaker of the House just came out of the White House and says there's no movement on negotiations. How ugly is this tomorrow?
It could be pretty ugly. I mean, well, and this is coming from somebody that, last week was enormously focused and still focused on disruptions in the banking sector, particularly around some of the regional banks. We shouldn't keep piling up one crisis after another on a market that based upon the underlying economic news, is actually still pretty good. But these self-inflicted problems, that's not really the right approach.
Senator, thank you so much for your time. Virginia Senator Mark Warner there. Coming up the program, we're going to continue with what is going on outside the White House. The battle over the debt ceiling is playing out. We have Speaker McCarthy right there on the driver, waiting for Senator likely Chuck Schumer to come out and give us his sense of what went on in this meeting. Right now, what we know is there'll be another meeting on Friday, and McCarthy says there's been no serious movement. This is Bloomberg.
And he met
this
with
is
me
Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV,
we were get
and a live view here of Speaker Kevin McCarthy in the driveway outside the West Wing following his meeting with President Biden and the other congressional leaders on the debt ceiling. This is Balance of Power with the news unfolding before our eyes. Anne-Marie Hordern with me here in Washington. And Anne-Marie, his initial comments on this meeting were not good. No progress was made, but we do have another meeting scheduled already.
Yeah, so I think the progress is in the fact that at least they're going to sit down again. I think markets will probably take that on board because it is concerning for markets right now and investors, especially those who hold Treasury bills. We are in that 1 month mark of when potentially Yellen says we have used all our extraordinary measures. But the staff will get together and we'll get back together the principals on Friday. Mm-hmm. So
presumably the same makeup as today.
Yes. So potentially this is the first of many, and maybe there will be a breakthrough.
With us also now at the table to talk through the potential market risks of a prolonged battle over the debt ceiling is Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lines with the X date in mind here, Kayleigh, and no progress today to report.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how ultimately this shakes out in the markets tomorrow, in the bond market, especially in the stock market as well, because we already have seen it show up in the Treasury market in some of those shorter maturity T-bills, the ones that mature in June, which is the month really in question here, are all yielding north of 5%, which is incredibly high in terms of yield. You've seen it showing up in people's willingness to buy what the Treasury is selling in these auctions for short-term bills as well. Just yesterday, we saw the highest yield on 3-month bills since 2001 of 5.14%. In the 1-month auction last week, 5.84%, which is the highest since 2000. Then when you look at credit default swaps, basically the cost of insuring against the U.S. not making a debt payment, those are right around a record high, north of 150 basis points. That is well beyond what we saw even back in 2011 when the credit rating of the United States was downgraded even before the X date. And to kind of use that episode as a guide here as to what we might expect should this situation not get resolved in a timely manner, like in 2011. In the month of August, we saw the S&P 500 fall 7%. And actually, perhaps counterintuitively, there was a massive rally in treasuries as people tried to rush to some perceived safety. And so we saw a rally in treasuries and gold, too. What we have to keep in mind here, though, that the market has to contend with isn't just what happens if we don't get a deal. It is also what could happen if we do get a deal and spending cuts have to be included in that. Lisa Shallett, the CIO of Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, was talking about that potential economic impact earlier today.
What's cut? Are there rollbacks of some of the Inflation Reduction Act spending related opportunities, some of the infrastructure spending that is kind of in motion? And those things have been a support to growth. And if we need to, take that out of the forward forecasts, that is going to dampen economic growth.
And I would remind you guys of the Mark Zandi note from Moody's that came out after McCarthy passed his bill that was talking about how the spending cuts he proposed would mean that at the end of 2024, GDP is 0.65% lower than it would be in a clean debt ceiling raise scenario, and employment would be about 780,000 fewer jobs. So again, McCarthy says he wants to come to the table here. He's willing to give and take a bit. But if we do see some kind of spending cuts like he wants, ultimately that could mean that the economy doesn't grow as much as it would have otherwise.
Yeah, it's going to be almost a complete recalibration depending on what we see out of this negotiation or potential default. All right, Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lines, thank you so much. To continue our conversation On the drama that's happening outside the White House right now, of course, the debt ceiling debate. Let's bring in Republican Senator from Florida, Rick Scott. Senator, thank you so much for your time. I will get to the spending cuts in a moment, but let's start about the financial concerns. Kayleigh just walked us through how much more expensive it is if you're an investor to hold short-term debt. Should Congress have just done what they did cleanly without some of the drama over the Trump administration and have raised the debt ceiling?
Absolutely not. Think about what the American public is dealing with right now. They're concerned with high inflation, and they're concerned about their retirement. Now, inflation is caused by reckless government spending. We've got it. $31.5 trillion worth of debt. We haven't lived within our means. We don't even have a plan to live within our means, and we don't even have a budget up here. So that's what's causing this inflation, which is hurting families all across the country. And why are people worried about their retirement? They see that their federal government is basically out of control with the spending. So how do you do this? You say to yourself, we should be acting just like every family does. They say, how do we balance our budget? How do we live within our means? And so we need to have a plan, and Kevin McCarthy put out a plan. Let's start the process of stopping wasteful spending, get people back to work. You shouldn't be on a government program if you're able-bodied and you don't have, young children or elderly parents you're responsible for. Grow the economy, which will create jobs, and eventually we'll get to a balanced budget. That's what we've got to be doing. So I'm very disappointed that nothing happened today. I mean, why are we in May when we knew about this problem? Actually, we knew about this problem last year. Why are we in May? We still don't have a solution. Joe Biden's got to show up. Kevin McCarthy passed a bill. Schumer put it on the floor. Let's see what we can pass in the Senate.
Understood, Senator. And we do get your position on the budgeting factor and inflation, but we're also looking at a very short timeline here. And I wonder if you think it's wise for both parties in this case, Speaker McCarthy and the White House, to say that they are not considering a short-term solution. Couldn't that buy time for cooler heads to prevail and maybe accomplish what it is you're describing?
Cooler heads haven't prevailed. I mean, Joe Biden has said all along, he doesn't want to negotiate. So what would be the value of saying, okay, we'll do this next month when we've had months and months and months to do this and Joe Biden's done nothing to get this done.
Well, because it might avoid a default, Senator, right?
But we'll be doing it next month. And in the meantime, we've got $31.5 trillion of debt. Is $35 trillion too much? Is $45 trillion too much? When do we say to ourselves, you know what, this doesn't work. We've got to deal with inflation that's hurting families all across the country. We've got to worry about our families that are worried about their retirement. Let's get our fiscal house in order. We can, I balance the budget every year I was governor of Florida. Everybody said you couldn't balance it. It had not been balanced in 20 years before I became governor. Every year they increased their debt. I balanced the budget. I actually paid off a third of the state debt. We could do it in a day up here if we would just sit down and say, you know what, this is how much money we have to spend. Let's allocate the money the best way we can, and then let's live within our means. We could do that. Families do it every day. We can do it up here. We just got to sit down and do it.
Senator, thank you for the time. Florida Senator Rick Scott, we appreciate that. We'd like to spend more time with the senator, but we want to bring you back live to the White House now. As we heard from Speaker McCarthy, Democrats are now at the microphones. Let's listen to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
He take default off the table. He refused. President Biden said he would. Leader Jeffries said he would. Of course, I said I would. But he wouldn't take it off the table. And instead of him giving us a plan to remove default, he gave us a plan to take default hostage. And that is a shame, because that makes things more complicated. The bottom line is very simple. There are large differences between the parties. If you look at what President Biden had proposed and you look at what Speaker McCarthy has proposed, they're very, very different. We can try to come together on those in a budget and appropriations process. But to use the risk of default with all the dangers that has for the American people as a hostage and say it's my way or no way, or mostly my way or no way, is dangerous. So we again repeat our plea to Speaker McCarthy. Take default off the table and let's resume negotiations in the budget process, in the appropriations process, where we have legitimate differences. That's the good news. The president asked the people from all four of the leaders and himself to start sitting down as early as tonight, certainly tomorrow, to see where we can come to an agreement on the budget and the appropriations process. There are probably some places we can agree and some places we can compromise, hopefully, but that has to occur as part of the budget appropriations process.
Thank you, Leader Schumer, and I thank President Biden for convening us to have this conversation. Under no circumstances should the United States default on our debt. America must always pay our bills. A default would be catastrophic for everyday Americans, for small businesses, for people all across the land. House Democrats have taken default off the table. Senate Democrats have taken default off the table. Senate Republicans, as just indicated by Leader McConnell, have taken default off the table. President Biden, from the very beginning, took default off the table. There's one group in Washington, D.C., extreme MAGA Republicans, who have indicated that they are willing to take us down the path of default. That is reckless, irresponsible, and extreme. We're thankful that President Biden has asked the four corners of the Capitol, along with the administration, to get together as early as this evening, if not tomorrow, to make sure that we can have a conversation about the budget, about the appropriations process, about spending and investments and revenue. And all four parties have agreed. Now, on timeline, let me just simply say, because there's been a narrative that has emerged from some of my friends on the House Republican side, that the delay, the reason why we're at this point, is because of inaction. Nothing can be further from the truth. President Biden and Speaker McCarthy met on February 1st. In that meeting, President Biden said, default is off the table, as it has been repeatedly during Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, including 3 times when we helped President Trump raise the debt ceiling without gamesmanship, partisanship, or brinksmanship. Simultaneously, we can have a discussion about the budget. President Biden said in that meeting, the administration will produce its budget for the American people by March 9th. The budget was produced by President Biden on March 9th. At the same time, he said, we need to understand the House Republican position. Produce your budget. March 9th came and went. No Republican budget. Week after week after week, through mid-March, into late March, into early March, into mid-April, all the way through to April 26, we saw no Republican plan, no Republican budget. And then on April 26, they passed one that was extreme, that put polluters over people, that dramatically cut Medicaid for disabled children and seniors, would cut veterans' benefits as we understand it, would cut health care, would cut law enforcement, would cut a variety of things that would undermine the health, the safety, the economic well-being of the American people. That wasn't passed, the Default on America Act, until April 26. The next day, the House went out of session. They were gone and did not return until today, when President Biden reconvened us to urgently deal with this issue.
We'll take a couple of quick questions. It's the wrong question. You have to, every time we pass a debt ceiling, it's bipartisan. His bill doesn't have a single Democrat in support, and it gets us nowhere, because you have to negotiate to get these done. what's really troubling about the Speaker's position is it's a partisan bill, and he says take it or leave it, or we could default. By not taking default off the table, Speaker McCarthy is greatly endangering America and making it much harder to make progress on budget negotiations. And so the bottom line is very, very simple. Mitch McConnell himself has said that the Speaker has to come to some kind of agreement with the President, and said that the Senate is never going to pass the House bill. McConnell has said that. So the idea that he passed a partisan bill that has no chance of being signed by the President and no chance of passing the Senate, and instead uses it, as he said, one of the reporters asked him, are you going to hold a gun to people's heads? He didn't deny it. He didn't deny it. This is very troubling. But if we can come together on an appropriations budget process as the way it's been done every time in the past, when President Trump was president, I was Democratic minority leader, I could have said, I'm holding it hostage unless we repeal the Trump tax cuts, your signature issue. I didn't do that. But McCarthy is saying, I'm holding it hostage unless you repeal the IRA, which was our signature issue, and is doing such good for the country.
Leader Schumer, you've talked several times about the regular budget and appropriations process. So how much
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer there in the driveway of the White House alongside House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries, both animated and speaking passionately about the meeting they just emerged from with President Biden. We, of course, brought you similar comments from Speaker Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell when they emerged from the West Wing. This is part of the dance here, as we knew, that there'd be a lot of cameras and a lot of reporters at the stakeout, as they call it, there in the driveway outside the West Wing, because everyone wants to frame what happened in that meeting. And I think it's safe to say no one is happy. Joining us now is our political panel with more on this. We welcome Rick Davis, Bloomberg politics contributor and partner at Stone Court Capital, as well as Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Kristen, let's get started here. You've been around for a couple of negotiations. You used to speak for the Blue Dog Democrats. Yes. This did not go the way anyone seemed to want it to go.
I think we kind of all expected that this was the first round of actual talks among the leaders, of many. So I don't think anybody was expecting some grand plan coming out of here. Mm-hmm. At some point, they're going to have to talk in good faith. The staffs are going to have to get together and talk in good faith. Still think there's time to do that. But you can tell, the messaging game is in full force. Both sides are sticking to their guns.
Right, but which is what you do, right, if you're working into an 11th-hour deal. Rick, one thing we just heard from Schumer say is that he said staff will meet tonight and tomorrow, begin talking about appropriations. Does that start to at least open the window to some sort of deal?
Yeah, of course it does, Anne-Marie. This deal will get done at the staff level. There's already been staff contact between the White House and the Speaker's office and probably the Minority Leader's office. And I think out of there will come some kind of a compromise. And that compromise is probably going to include something toward cuts in spending. They may separate them out so that the president gets his integrity of comment that he said he wants a clean debt limit. And yet there's no such thing as a deal unless Speaker McCarthy gets something for his time. And his time means spending cuts.
Rick, though, you wonder who the audience is today as we wonder what's going to happen in the stock market tomorrow. It's CPI day. And I remember talking with you when he emerged from his first meeting with President Biden in early February. Remember, he projected optimism. There was at least a hope that they would find, as he used, the words he used, that we could find common ground. I didn't hear that from anyone today. Is that a mistake on both sides' part?
Well, we heard that from Mitch McConnell, who's done more of these debt ceiling deals than anybody who was in front of microphones today. And he knows the impact of the markets, and he was trying, I think, in his own way of settling them. But by his own voice, he's kind of taken himself out of the negotiating process. So even though it's an important comment he made about the fact that we will not default, that Sherman-esque statement should have been really iterated by the Speaker and everybody else who came to a microphone today. So I think that is a shortcoming that this team needs to sharpen up over the next couple of days, is that there will not be a default. We may have a ugly negotiating session and no progress today, but nobody's committed to letting this ceiling get broken.
But one thing Joe Schumer said was Speaker McCarthy refused. Now, he's reporting what's in the room. We obviously were not there, but he said Speaker McCarthy refused to take default off the table. Do you think McConnell is hanging back now, but at some point will get a little bit more hands-on?
I can't imagine he won't. I mean, he's a master negotiator, and for somebody that sticks to his word generally. And I think it's, first of all, going back, it's important for these leaders to express optimism, and they should. For the American people, for the markets, for businesses across this country. We saw that the White House was having business leaders call, members of Congress, talking to them about how important this is.
Well, so with that said, do they right the ship tomorrow in the communications department here? I mean, everyone seemed to be kind of annoyed coming out of that meeting. I don't know what they expected. We didn't expect a deal to come out of this. But Joe Biden didn't make the speaker happy, apparently. And Chuck Schumer's speaking kind of for Joe Biden here. So do we get a more optimistic tone in the morning?
I mean, I wouldn't expect it. I would hope so at some point. I mean, people need to be adults. We need to start talking about this in a responsible manner. And the speaker, just baseline, it's not responsible to Senator Schumer's point. The Democrats didn't hold the debt limit hostage. It's not responsible to do that. It's something that the Republicans have done over the years, just as an example, 2011. It generally happens when they're in charge and there's a Democratic president. But at some point, everybody's going to have to come to the table. The one thing I'll say is, Speaker McCarthy keeps talking about the president needs to come with me, give me specific examples of budget cuts, which is not really something that he did. He got agreement on a across-the-board cut. But once you start talking about exactly what those are, I'm sure he has problems within his own conference about, what to do about those.
Oh, certainly.
Like
I think a lot of individuals that were able to help get that bill across the floor knew that this was a leveraging tactic for the speaker.
Right.
We do have some other news, if you can imagine today, and a pretty insane day in terms of news flow. But New York Congressman George Santos is charged. The federal prosecutors have filed charges against the House lawmaker. This is according to reports. This is CNN reporting to this. And he's expected, Joe, to appear in court as soon as Wednesday.
Incredible.
Rick, if we could just bring these two stories back together, the debt ceiling and what's going on with Congressman Santos. What Kristen is talking about is how lots of members of McCarthy's own conference didn't want some of these cuts that were in the bill, but they knew it was a leveraging tool. And the last person who voted on that bill to get McCarthy over the finish line with this leveraging tool was Congressman Santos. How worried should Republicans be that this individual may no longer be able to serve?
Yeah, I hope they get a debt ceiling bill done before the prosecution gets completed on Congressman Santos. And you make an important point. Speaker McCarthy only had one vote to spare. Four guys took a walk on him, and he was within a vote of losing the vote on his own debt ceiling package, the one that he used today to flog President Biden and say, hey, I passed a debt ceiling package already. Nobody else has done any of this stuff. And as you say, this is not a real bill. Nobody who actually walked the plank for the speaker actually thinks that this was going to be the bill that they would use. So this Santos thing, I mean, it was almost predictable. We've been talking about whether or not he has violated any kind of campaign finance rules or ethics provisions. This is obviously a federal prosecution. So we still are waiting, I think, as far as I know, to hear exactly what the charges are.
That is true, Rick. The charges remain under seal, and we want to be clear about that. But sources have made it clear to us as well that the Department of Justice has been probing Santos for campaign finance violations. Kristen, this could be the end of his career.
I mean, I think it definitely could. I'm looking forward to not talking about him anymore. So, but
I'm not sure I believe that. I think people have had a little bit of fun with it.
We have. But, going back to the narrow margins and what this means for the speaker, I mean, the Democrats actually have a little bit more leverage. He's going to need their votes eventually for whatever happens with the debt limit. Just how many remains to be seen. So he's playing with these very narrow margins, which makes that game of chess three-dimensional.
Yeah, it certainly does. This is going to be very complicated. Another one that I imagine another headache for the speaker. Of course, we had one other huge story out today, and that's, of course, the former president. A federal judge in New York found Trump liable for sexually assaulting writer E. Jean Carroll, and he's going to have to be paying up for that. Rick, at some point, does all of this become a problem for the Republican Party? Because at the moment, he is the front runner.
Oh, sure. Could you imagine nominating a presidential candidate who has just inside the election cycle been convicted of sexual assault. It's beyond my comprehension how we actually get to the finish line with a candidate who can win with this kind of problem. And this is just the beginning stages of his legal dramas. And we still have Georgia prosecutors looking at what he's doing. We have the federal prosecutor, special prosecutor with 2 or more potential indictments. It's head spinning to think that the leader of the Republican primary to date, and these are all early polls and we should not go to bank on them, but the leader by a lot has this heavy a baggage of legal drama still ahead of him.
Yeah, it's also pretty mind-blowing for Democrats, Kristen, that he's blowing Joe Biden out of the water in some hypothetical polls, certainly the one we saw by ABC and Washington Post over the weekend. How confounding is this when people want to talk about Joe Biden's age instead of Donald Trump being held liable for sexual assault?
It's confounding on a number of different levels, but unfortunately it's nothing new. Donald Trump has done things over and over and over again, said abhorrent things, done abhorrent things, and the list goes on. And I think we as a party need to figure out politically how we deal with that. I think, I would like to think that this could be a game changer. He's been convicted, but I'm not certain.
Imagine the conversations, Anne-Marie, inside the West Wing tonight.
Yeah.
Pick your topic.
Yeah, exactly. Pick your topic. But also the staff level budget talks, they are starting tonight.
That's right.
That is a window. You can see a potential negotiation.
Let's call
unfolding.
it progress for all of our sake, Anne-Marie. The next meeting will be on Friday. Many thanks to our political panelists, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital, and Kristen Hahn of Rock Solutions.
That's it for Balance of Power. See you back here tomorrow. From Washington, this is Bloomberg.